Hey all, and welcome to the very first official Film in Vermont podcast episode, where our intention is to have conversations with creatives making things in Vermont, and also selfishly I get to chat with really cool people doing really cool things. My name is Brian Carroll, and I am your host. Our very first guest is a DP, a director, an editor, a writer, and the list goes on and on. He and I share a lot of the same sensibilities when it comes to creation and our visual aesthetics, and I feel very, very lucky to have him as the first guest on this podcast. His latest film is a doc about Cabot, Vermont, the community's resiliency during the floods of 2023 and 2024, which is currently screening on Vermont Public. His past work includes DP'ing the horror comedy The Yorkie Werewolf, which was set here in Vermont, a handful of wonderfully spooky horror shorts, and as a side note, you should go right now and watch his super short film, Garlic, and commercial work spanning family-operated local Vermont companies to large international sports networks. Our very first guest is the incredibly thoughtful and ever-creative Seth Grant. And I just want to say that I truly enjoyed sitting down in my living room with Seth to have this conversation about Vermont, how things can happen here, and what he's been up to. Enjoy. Yeah, I guess we should probably start with who you are, and what are your ties to the state of Vermont, and what do you do? I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. My name is Seth Grant. I am a DP currently residing in New Jersey, right beside New York City. And I lived in Vermont from 2020 to 2024. Got family who is from here and moved here with my wife after COVID happened, and all my jobs, I was living in North Carolina at the time, and all my jobs disappeared. So moved here to live a comfortable life in the mountains, and like kind of just start my life after college. And yeah.
So in terms of how you would, quote, sell yourself, I guess, primarily at this point in time, you would shop yourself. If you're out there looking for jobs, you would say you're a DP, right? But we had been talking, you wear many hats, as do so many Vermont filmmakers or creative media professionals. So for educational purposes, I guess, could you give us the elevator pitch of what a DP does? Of what is a DP responsible for on set, and kind of how you work as a professional in that field?
Absolutely. There's actually a lot I want to touch on in this. And when you talked to me about doing this, I was thinking about this in the car. I'll start with exactly what you asked. So a director of photography is a DP. A director of photography is in charge of the bridge of kind of the creative and technical. So you are equally having a very strong creative vision, creative say over the visuals of the film. You are in charge of the camera team and the lighting team, and both of those are your ultimate goal is to try to help bring the visuals to life in the way that the director has kind of seen them. And a lot of times that you're bringing your own artistic vision to that. You're kind of partnering with the director. It's not just trying to do things by a blueprint or exactly how they want it to happen. So you're trying to it's a lot of collaboration, and it's team leadership of trying to creatively and technically bring to life an image. So I call myself a DP. And even when I was living in Vermont, I was calling myself a DP, which is, I don't think it's a falsehood. But it's interesting, now that I live in New Jersey and I'm right next to New York City, it is kind of important to niche down into what role that you want to be hired as. Production is a lot more concentrated there, so you do need to have specific roles that you want to do. But it's interesting in Vermont. I think the better classification here for what I would call myself here is a filmmaker, just a plain filmmaker, which in New York sounds really pretentious. But up here, you kind of learn this mentality of you got to do everything because there's just not a lot going on, and so you end up doing wearing a lot of hats.
Okay, so elaborating further on that note, how do you think you benefited from that, having that hat for a number of years, doing that? I mean, I guess that's a lot of the way things are, like when you're in film school or in college. It's, people are working on each other's projects, and I need somebody to hold the boom pole. I need somebody to be a second camera op. How has that benefited you in, your current situation, being in a more niche kind of a geography where you do need to scale back and say, this is what I am, maybe best at, maybe not best at, but this is where my current focus is.
I was really nervous moving to New York about that specifically because I never, even though I felt like I was a DP, I had a lot of imposter syndrome, and I'm still a very green DP. I'm not heavily experienced by any means, but yeah, moving to New York, I was feeling pretty insecure about it and not knowing how I should pitch myself as niche down. And now I feel like it's my greatest strength because I think the industry is shifting so much that you've got your huge big budget stuff going on still, and you've got your tiny stuff, the stuff where it's like you might have two people on set, a sound guy and a someone who can call themselves a DP but is a little bit of a glorified videographer, which is fine. Still pays the bills, but that middle realm of like you've got 3, 4, 5 people on set with you who are working under you is, I think, going away. And so being that more kind of wear a lot of hats person, I think, is really important during this age of like shrinkage that's happening in our industry. And I'm finding I'm meeting a lot of people in the industry who can't find jobs because they're niched down into, they can only do one thing. They only know one skill. And I think that's a really tough place to be in right now.
So I was thinking maybe we could shift to more specifics, and arguably your biggest Vermont project, the Yorkie Werewolf. Can we maybe dig into that and your experience with working on that, which arguably is a fairly sizable budget for most of the projects that are happening in Vermont in the current landscape for things. It's a feature. There's a fairly large cast. There are a lot of people. What was your experience creating a film in Vermont of that scale? And I think Michael tried to utilize as much of Vermont as he could in terms of hiring people on and things like that. So could we maybe start with some of the positives of working with a crew in Vermont, and then maybe we can talk about some of the challenges after?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll introduce it fully. So I worked on a film that shot in 2022. It's called The Yorkie Werewolf. It's a feature film. It's a horror comedy directed by Michael DiBiasio Ornelas and produced by him and his wife, Rebecca de Ornelas. And yeah, it's a quirky, campy comedy feature or horror comedy. And it's just a big goof. It was a blast to shoot, and I got the role. I applied as a gaffer originally. They were looking for a local crew. They had just moved from New York. They were living in Vermont. They just moved. They hadn't really met the scene around here. Didn't really know, weren't really tied into production here yet. So they were doing like online job applications that they were posting different places, and stumbled upon it. And I had a friend, when he was applying for it as well, he pitched me as being a good DP, which I was very thankful to him for. We had worked together a couple of times. And then I applied as the gaffer, and I talked with Michael, and I got the gaffer position, which I was excited for. And granted, right now I'm 28 years old, and I was 25, 26 at the time. Very young, very green still. And still am. But then he called me one day, maybe 3 weeks before we started shooting, and said, I don't have a DP. The person who was going to do it has dropped. Would you be interested? And I was like, give me a day. Give me a day to think about it. I read the script and did everything and ultimately decided, yes, I was going to go for it. And we went from there. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that Can you remind me of your question?
I guess just in general, because you and I have talked a little bit about this, but and there's one specific story that I'm trying to guide you towards that you have told me previously. But like what are some of the benefits of filming something in this state where, so frequently what I hear in my own capacity as somebody who's doing their best to try to foster a community and doing the little bits that I can do, or hear people's story through this conduit that we're talking on right now, is we don't have tax incentives. We don't have legislative support. We don't have these bigger picture things that people tend to gravitate towards. But there are positives too, right? And the one story that you told me involving a restaurant maybe is something that you can share and elaborate on as a kind of success story or a triumph,
Yeah, definitely. During filming, there was a lot of different things up in the air. It was a low budget film. I don't know what the final budget came out to be, but it was about, I think, $250,000 feature when we were in production. So yeah, small budget, but we still had some significance to us. But every location was, we didn't shoot on any sound stages. Every location was real. Every location was on location. And so locations were a big thing, and trying to find them and source them in a place where there wasn't really wasn't a database at the time or any form of finding them was pretty difficult. And I wasn't producing, so I wasn't a big part of that. But we'll cut to the chase. We were shooting mid-shoot. It was a 13-day shoot. We were mid-shoot, and we found out that the location that we were supposed to be in 3 days later or 4 days later dropped out. It was a major location. It was a restaurant we needed to be in for like 4 days, and they fully dropped out, and we were scrambling. And I was like, I have a friend who is a manager at a bar. Maybe I'll reach out to them, see what I can pull. Reached out to them. They were like, "Oh yeah, that sounds like fun. Let me call my friend who owns this or is a manager at this other place." And we got into the 126, which is a really cool downtown cocktail bar and lounge in Burlington, Vermont. And it was just friends of friends, and they were super excited and happy to have us and host us, and they were really kind and wonderful, and it was a blast. It was a blast. Really thankful that came together. And so, yeah, I think the benefit of filming here is everything is pretty accessible. And if you ask and aren't a jerk, you can make things happen pretty easily. And like, nobody's going to walk out and like yell at you if you've got a tripod out or, everybody here is pretty nice. And as long as you aren't here to screw anybody over and be nice back, you can usually get away with a lot of things that you wouldn't be able to in larger filming cities.
Mm-hmm. Love that. Well, how about some of the challenges, I guess, that you see now that you're living and working in arguably one of the top two biggest places for the industry in the country? What are you seeing in terms of the challenges that you would face here comparatively to a place with so many resources? Aside from the obvious, there's not a lot of larger scale productions come here because they're not getting a kickback from the state. What else do you see as a challenge that potentially we can try to work on for the future?
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about this. First thought is, most of the crew on Yorkie Werewolf were very green. They were very much right out of college, right out of film school. We were all people who were excited and pumped to be on this project, but didn't have a ton of knowledge to bring. And so a lot of the film, it felt like We were all kind of learning while we did it. And in Vermont, there weren't many more options. And of course, I do have to give the caveat of like the film wasn't a big budget film. We aren't able to hire really well seasoned professionals and like, give them their full rate and say this is going to be an experience that you're going to walk away at least feeling well paid. Like that wasn't on the table. So I do have to say that, and there are some good, well experienced people here, but for the most part, um, people here don't get an opportunity to learn very often because there aren't productions happening at that scale very often, and so it all just kind of feeds into each other. Of like when there's not a lot of productions happening, you don't get to learn on that level. And that means when they do happen, then the crew being hired, they're going to have to pull from somewhere else like New York City or Boston because they're going to be the only ones who are experienced. And then for the few people who are really experienced here, if one production rolls through, everybody's taken. And if anybody else, like if another production needs to be here at the same time, then there's nobody left. So it's a difficult thing to try to deal with. One thing I remember very specifically, there's not really a lot of rental houses. Like there's one person who I know is renting stuff here as a rental house. And if they're shooting something, then they kind of have their stuff booked out. So um, I remember I couldn't find a combo stand. I was like looking for a combo stand, which is a pretty basic form of grip gear, for a long time, and I never found it. And then I ended up just having to like, a friend was like, "Well, I'll buy one if you'll rent it from me for the duration." I was like, "Can you just," like I pieced together like a whole like camera and rental package from just multiple people who were just uh people who had miscellaneous pieces of gear and pulling favors from people to do things, and there was no way to just like, okay, this is everything that I need, this is the infrastructure to support that. That wasn't able to happen here.
I greatly appreciate Seth's candor and his honesty in his discussion, but sadly, his story is one that's all too common. Creatives moved here around the turn of the pandemic, and then work simply wasn't feasible to warrant staying here. A good portion of creative professionals living here indicate that a large percentage of their work actually occurs outside of the state. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure for larger scale productions. Housing for crew, rental houses. Where can someone locally pick up an Alexa Mini for a week? And crew, while enthusiastic, may lack the more in-depth large-scale knowledge of bigger cities and states. There's a ton of work to build and foster an industry that is sustainable for creatives here in Vermont. And in the absence of things like major tax incentives, another thing we hear all too often about, being creative, about being able to make things happen here is something that Vermont filmmakers have been really great at figuring out. But there's still so much more work to be done in that realm. We talked a little bit about this when you were up last time, and finding whatever it is your style is, and maybe that's something that's really amorphous and constantly evolving and changes with what project you're working on. But are there other cinematographers or creatives that are out there creating whose work you're particularly excited about, or maybe you want to emulate or pick and choose bits and pieces from that you really respect?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting that you say it right now. I do feel like I'm in a weird spot right now where I'm thinking I'm in the process of producing and directing another documentary. So I'm got that hat on more than I do DP work. Um, but I do feel like I'm really trying to go for naturalism more and more. And I feel like a Yorkie Werewolf was a lot of days on set for me for that was like, I think we'll just put the lights there and it'll work. And then we did it and it was like, okay, I guess that kind of works. Um, Now I'm trying to be a lot more intentional and push towards naturalism rather than like like enhanced, like overly enhanced Hollywoodized look. I'm trying to think of examples. right now. The simplicity of something like the film Nomadland, I really loved, and I think that also goes to the kinds of films I feel like making right now, which are just smaller human stories. Um, so yeah, I don't necessarily have any DPs right now that I'm really watching and looking at, though. I was a Greg Fraser fanboy before he got big with Batman and Dune, but not to say I was one of the OGs of his work, but no, he's always been really amazing, and I really respect how good his work comes out to be.
Well, maybe we can get a little bit more specific, at least how it kind of pertains to Yorkie Werewolf and your work on that, and specifically about the the scene where there's like the standoff in the woods where they're carrying those, I don't know if it's LED, the balls that they have, and
Yeah.
I was struck because obviously night scenes are very difficult to light, right, to make it look like actual moonlight. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how you used your piecemeal together lighting kit you mentioned to make that look really good, in my opinion?
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, so the end of the film, there's a lot of aspects to that. Number one, it snowed um our last week of production, and we looked at our timeline and what we were shooting, and we are like, honestly, this, we're not shooting we didn't shoot completely in order, but the way we did it, it was like this all works. So, and it wasn't like we had another choice. It snowed. There's gonna be snow in the movie now. So there's snow, which is very reflective, which is helpful when you're doing night stuff. Um, I did this thing where I set up like 4 lights in kind of an arc to replicate this kind of like moonlight side light kind of thing that fell one direction. And then I also there was like this gag, or this like light gag of, there was like these magical orbs, green orbs that were written into the film. And so we had, I think they were like pool lights from Home Depot, and they could turn green, and that's what they were holding. And then every like other actor in the scene had like an aperture LED bulb. And so they're like holding it in a way to hide the bulb portion, and just you see the round top of it.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And so those are like mixed in to like help actually fill the scene with green light. So that was all I did. It just the combo of those two things. And it worked out.
Yeah. Maybe we can switch gears a little bit. And I think that, right, we talked a little bit about gaining experience and larger scale productions and not having those opportunities. But something that Vermont does have a plethora of is people with interesting stories. And while it does seem like narrative features are, kind of going by the wayside unless it's Marvel Universe or something like that these days, docs are doing pretty well. They're on all the major streamers. Like every other day, I feel like there's something new to watch on Netflix. Granted, there are a lot of sports stuff, a lot of true crime and things like that. But I think what Vermont does have is people hidden in these hills and nooks and crannies with really interesting stories, and we also have this overwhelming sense of community here. So you put on, kept your DP hat on, but also put on your producer and director hat with your Harry's documentary. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk about how you approach something like that a little bit differently. And whereas you're coming into somebody else's project, kind of with some marching orders about, you're going to do this and you have this specific role and you should, have creative input, but also stay in your lane as well. When you're approaching something like the Harry's doc, which I'll let you kind of introduce as well and say what it's all about, how do you kind of shift focus and approach a project like that?
Yeah, so Harry's Hardware, or the title is a little bit long and convoluted, so I apologize. Harry's One Vermont Community and the Flood of 2023. That's the full title. is a documentary about a hardware store in Cabot, Vermont called Harry's Hardware. It is a combo bar and hardware store. They've created a really unique space there that is like the only major third place in that community for people to come and hang out and talk to each other. And the film is about them dealing with a really devastating flood in 2023 where it almost took out the whole building, and it by some miracle didn't. It was the miracle was the owner of the business being there and throwing bags of grain against the door to stop the water from coming in. And it was about the community kind of coming together and helping rebuild. So very community focused film. Can you just remind me the question specifically that you asked about it?
I guess like when you're putting on a different hat than as you would with like I mean, it could be narrative versus doc, but also when like this, I feel like you're wearing multiple hats. You're really driving this whole project pretty much with the help of your producer Neil and things like that. But how do you approach something like this differently? A doc versus a narrative feature, or something that's your own project versus you being part of the broader team and something else.
Yeah, definitely. This is definitely where, kind of like the term filmmaker, I think, comes in, because, it's hard to like you roll credits in the end and you go, I was the director, the producer, the editor, the filmmaker is such a much nicer term to throw in than to label yourself as everything. Anyways, my approach to docs is I always try to be really community focused. And I say that, and what I mean is, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show up to whoever the doc is about, whoever the main people are about, without a camera. I'm going to hang out with them. I'm going to have phone calls with them. I'm going to chat with them. We're going to talk about the story. We're going to talk about what it looks like for me to be there with a camera. And my goal is just to be comfortable and let them know I'm a real person. I'm not just showing up, shoving a camera in their face and stealing their story and walking away. Because I think that I feel like I see that, you kind of see that happen sometimes. And it feels like a real shame, because it feels like the documentarian is really just using the story for their own benefit. And my goal is to never do that. Like, if I'm telling a story, I want it to be additive in some way and not just taking something. That being said, so this was a lower budget piece. And this was something to just try to help captivate this moment in time for this community. And so it was really just me showing up with a camera, doing a couple days of interviews, and then piecing together footage from when the flood happened, and then trying to collect a few final touches to things to try to really pull the story together. I had like one person come and help and assist on the days I did the interviews, and help look over my shoulder and make sure the cameras are running and help set up lights and stuff. But it was a really simple shoot, really simple production, and it was really just more focused on grabbing the story and the edit.
Do you think that has the potential to add to something if someone isn't sitting there in front of A cam, B cam with a giant key light off to their left, and it's really just it becomes a conversation, right? I feel like the second you introduce a camera into the equation, like the word documentary kind of like, are you really documenting people in an authentic manner if the second that the red button is on, do you think having that scaled back kind of focus can show some benefit?
I definitely think so. I think, I don't think there's any wrong way to do it, honestly. I just did a project. I assisted on a project, I should say, that was like we shot one day for I don't think I'm allowed to say what project it was, but where the final budget, if it was made, is like a proof of concept day that we shot. But if it was made, the final budget would be like a $1.5 million doc. That's a pretty big budget. And yet the director spent like 14 hours riding in the car from like a road trip, basically, without a camera, just hanging out with the people he was filming. And it was just to get to know them and stuff. And then they got to the location we did the interview, and it was just the director and I was setting up lights, and we had the DP shooting, and yeah, it was still very authentic and really focused on the person who was telling the story. And then for what I did, it was a little bit similar of a approach to have a phone call, show up and hang out, have a conversation. And then when I came back with an assistant, and we set up a light, and we sat down and had a conversation. And I think it's still documenting someone's story. And then what I always really love to do is go back and, once I get that interview, is see if I can have them walking and talking, saying the same thing in the interview, but we're showing we're playing show and tell. We're showing exactly where something happened, how it happened, and where it's a little bit more dynamic, feels a little bit more verite. So it does feel more like it is documenting a real situation rather than sitting down and being kind of sedentary and in the approach. I still, if that gets back to your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think a well-lit talking head is a beautiful thing, but
yeah,
watching it for 45 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever it may be does get a little bit old. So, and you saying that, watching the Harry's doc a few times, I can definitely see that as part of your process where, you had your sit-down interview, but then you also had Joanna, the protagonist of the story, I guess, going around and showing where things specifically happen, which added, especially there's like the part when she goes down into the basement and shows like this is where half the basement floor was missing and you could see the river through. It adds so much more to it.
Yeah, right. And that shot of her going down the stairs, that was at the time, present day, after they'd already fixed the downstairs section. And so, just that moment of her walking downstairs and then cut to 8 months earlier when the flood had just happened and the downstairs had fallen away. That little piece of walking downstairs with her is so additive to trick your brain into feeling like we're going down to see it at the time of when it happened. And making it feel alive and exciting.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, you're currently working on a Vermont project. You're in Vermont right now as we are speaking.
I am
in my living room. So there is something that's there is something that's intriguing to you that's pulling you back here for work. Interestingly enough, it's after you've you've already moved. And I don't know, maybe that's something we talk about after that project comes out. But what else? What do you hope to see for the future of film in Vermont, and what do you see the landscape? Because I've heard a lot of people say I would love for one large studio production to come here a year so people can get experience. I would love for like a mini series to get shot here, or other people just say I would love there to be more opportunities for people who are already here to create more things. And also I've heard people say, well, it's never going to be, the place where lots of productions are going to come and actually shoot films, but maybe it becomes the post-production hub or something like that. So where do your hopes lie for what the state looks like in the future, 5 years down the road or whatever it may be?
Yeah. I don't know. I think it would just be cool to see more opportunities here. I think I left because there just wasn't opportunity. I wasn't I found my one big opportunity, which was Yorkie Werewolf, and I'm so thankful for that. And I would have worked on a feature film had I not been in Vermont. I mean, I shot a feature film at 25, 26. That's crazy. And I'm so thankful for that. And yet at the same time, like, I did that and I walked out of it and I was like, wow, I'm actually I'm gonna start doing stuff now. And then, like, I had my worst financial year ever the year after. And um I was when I was living here, I was piecing together a life freelancing by doing wedding videography to editing different things. Like, I was doing literally anybody who called me and said, "Hey, can you like do this?" I'd be like, "Yeah, sure." Because once when you're desperate like that, you got to say yes to everything. And I think I see a lot of other people having to do the same thing. And if they're not, then they are working either a part-time job and supplementing their creative kind of freelancing, or they're working a full-time job and then they just take off whenever a project, like a production, comes up. And this state just has a very few select professionals who can survive off of freelance alone. So, all of that to be said, it'd be cool to see more opportunity, whether that's commercials coming into the state and shooting on location, whether that's a TV series that pops up and shot every year here. That would be like really awesome. I mean, that happened in New Mexico with Breaking Bad, right? Like, if a show like that was to show up and just take hold here, then the people will learn on set and then they'll work and they'll consistently work and get better and be on every show. I think the problem is we're like entering periods in this industry that it's like we're shrinking, it's tough, and I think it's just a hard time. I think this industry is in a really tough spot right now. And yeah, I mean, I'm still hopeful though. And I think there's a lot of creative people here who all want to do stuff. And I think the downside is just there's not a lot of paying projects. Yeah. So that's my hope. More paying projects, more projects that want to provide jobs.
I just want to thank Seth so much for taking the time to be our first guest on this podcast. We will see where it goes. But yeah, taking time out of his busy schedule while he was up shooting his next documentary project to sit down for a half an hour, 40 minutes, and talk about filming in the state and the challenges that a filmmaker might see, and share some of the triumphs too, because I think it's important to balance those things when we're talking about an industry and building upon that. We'll link all of Seth's relevant stuff below, his website, his YouTube channel, and be sure to check out what he is working on. And while we're here, like, subscribe, all of that stuff that you're supposed to say, but really every little bit helps when we're trying to promote this thing and give it some legs as it gets off the ground. Till next time, my name is Brian Carroll, and this has been Film in Vermont.